Sex and Intelligent Design. It is important to acknowledge that few subjects are more difficult to address in our culture today than the nature of human sexuality and sexual identity. Not in the sense that the subject is taboo, but rather because today's unprecedented sexual libertinism and radical ideological activism regarding sexual orientation and identity have been practically placed above criticism. To write or speak on the subject from a Christian standpoint is to invite hostility both inside and outside the church, and risk causing offense to those unwilling to hear counter perspectives to their ideology of choice in an ostensibly free society. Nonetheless, questioning or refuting the current status quo is not a so-called microaggression, neither is it a threat to anyone's safety. On the contrary, all can benefit from open discussion about the critical issue of human identity and sexuality. To begin with, in addressing the matter of sexuality, considering the foundational role of a person's world and life view is very important. Without taking one's underlying assumptions about the world into account, human thinking in areas like human sexuality remains uncritical, shallow, and superficial. The central role of worldview comes to light when we consider that the contrast and conflict between a Christian and secular view is grounded in underlying presuppositions about the very nature of reality. The dominant cultural vision of human sexuality has undeniably changed radically in the last 60 years. Although the younger generation might not be fully cognizant of that, it is beyond all dispute that we live in an age of revolution. This revolutionary upheaval is revealed most dramatically in the area of human sexuality. For example, we have seen the historically novel development of legal and social practices like no-fault divorce, celebration of sex outside of marriage, and abortion as contraception, with not even a pretended desire for holding together in a social and moral union love, sex, and child rearing in the permanent bond of the natural family. These things would have been socially unthinkable prior to World War II. Moreover, we have the promotion and the celebration of what were for centuries considered anti-normative forms of sexual behavior, including homosexuality, bisexuality, pornography, and prostitution, and increasingly, even the denial of real normative distinctions between male and female sexes. What is today dubbed gender mainstreaming regards male and female sex as fictive, and it seeks to reinvent humanity in terms of a gender-blending abstraction in the name of liberation and empowerment. In short, we have seen in the last 30 years the sexualization and pornification of most cultural life. Now, the critical question that emerges from this revolutionary fervor is whether or not there are creational norms being subverted in this process. Historically, societies that have attacked the norm of marriage and family as the context for human sexual expression, with the structure of the family forging one's identity, have declined and collapsed, the Soviet Union being a modern example. In other words, the question of human sexuality forces us to confront the question of whether or not the world and the human world of sexual interaction has a purpose, a design, a goal, in short, a meaning. Is human sexuality meaningful or meaningless? There has been talk and action for 2 generations in the name of sexual liberation, leaving half of young people today growing up in homes without both parents. But has the result been freedom, health, the success of our children? Is pornography promoting social and sexual health? The Christian apologist G.K. Chesterton warned that the contemporary revolutionary spirit may end up destroying what it claims to set free if it is working against a creational purpose. Here's what he says. and I quote, "You can free things from alien or accidental laws, but not from the laws of their own nature. You may, if you like, free a tiger from his bars, but do not free him from his stripes. Do not free a camel of the burden of his hump. You may be freeing him from being a camel. Do not go about as a demagogue, encouraging triangles to break out of the prison of their three sides. If a triangle breaks out of its three sides, its life comes to a lamentable end." End quote. If there are creational norms for human sexuality, then violation of these norms assaults our own humanity and destroys human flourishing. The simple fact is that the contemporary revolution is openly directed against the Christian conception of God that shaped our society for generations, and indeed creational order itself, which is sustained and upheld in the Christian perspective by the Word of God. The Bible republishes and explicates that creation word, and is therefore vehemently opposed by the artisans of the new sexual order. So before considering the Christian idea of creational design and sexual order, it is important to briefly survey the roots of critical ideas that have decisively shaped popular cultural fashions about sexuality today, many of which young people accept uncritically. One major force in shaping today's vision of sexuality is contemporary radical feminism. Feminist philosophy affected life at every level in the latter part of the 20th century, especially in terms of mainstreaming concepts and ideas like gender identity, patriarchy, and social justice. Radical feminist thought was concerned to challenge the dominant ideas of objectivity, rationality, universal truth, and the human self. The movement has championed socialism, Marxism, pragmatism, and postmodernism. It laid much of the groundwork for the LGBTQ movement today, which is challenging every social norm for human sexuality and identity in the history of Western civilization. One forerunner of modern feminism was Simone de Beauvoir, the longtime lover of existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, and a thinker in her own right. Critically, throughout her work, she argued that gender was simply a social construct, making statements that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. She championed a form of feminism that rejected all sexual restraint, marriage, motherhood, and family. In fact, de Beauvoir was a virulent critic of marriage and a defender of abortion. She set up an abortion center in her Paris salon while it was still illegal. She actually regarded the marriage union and child rearing as fundamental to the alleged oppression of women. Accordingly, she asserted that normative marriage between men and women and the idea of the nuclear family, along with the church that sponsors this arrangement, must be destroyed. She claimed that marriage killed love, but since she was never married and was childless, it is difficult to see how she could make such a claim. Nonetheless, she is a mother of many of the modern attitudes towards human sexuality. Another important figure worthy of note is Jacques Derrida, an influential French philosopher in the second part of the 20th century. He deployed the now familiar idea of deconstruction, not only in reading texts for alternative meanings, but as a method of conceptual critique for destabilizing what he called traditional binary oppositions like male and female, truth and fiction. Derrida's goal was to approach reality in terms of the deferment of truth and meaning. Reality could not be understood in terms of any objective meaning. Everything was dependent on the endless web of language. Along with his postmodern counterparts, his attack on binary oppositions, including the categories of male and female, has influenced modern views of sex and gender. Another important French thinker who influenced our times in regard to sexuality with his neo-Marxist ideas of oppression was Michel Foucault. He argued that standards of truth and falsehood are simply culturally conditioned conceptual frameworks of language and thought. In other words, everything is really relative and there is no objective knowledge. Claims to know universal truth were, in his view, masks for systems of power and control. What we call human nature, including sexual nature, is only the product of historically conditioned forces of oppression. Embracing this idea, he claimed, liberates you to run your own experiment of living. Foucault was wildly promiscuous, practiced homosexuality, and tragically died of AIDS. Although diverse in their backgrounds, goals, and applications, one common thread between these thinkers and others is the belief that evil was not rooted in the human heart, but inside societal structures. Combining Marxism and sociology, they believed existing structures must be shattered in favor of a new utopian future where freedom, games, pleasure, eroticism, and pornography would be a daily routine for humankind. This could only be accomplished, they believe, by continued radical revolution. Their message, resting on their worldview, was relatively simple. There is no living God, nor any law order and creational design for human beings and their sexuality. Thus, seeking liberation from the feelings of guilt and shame that come with sexual immorality, liberation, they argued, only comes when one frees oneself from oppressive Christian sexual morality by living out any and all libidinous urges, thereby creating a social paradise free from all domination. In the same vein, the lesbian radical, third-wave feminist Judith Butler came with the concept of gender mainstreaming. Now, Butler claims the authority to change the very fabric of human sexual identity through political and legal measures. This new gender ideology grips our culture today like a vice. It's all around you, even though most people have never heard the term. This construct means that out go male and female, father and mother, husband and wife, as the two sexes in normative marital relationship. For Butler, like the other intellectuals mentioned, these norms are artificial constructs. As the two creational sexes exit the scene in this new neo-Marxist worldview, in comes the term gender to replace them. Now concentrate here, because according to Butler, sex is an ideal construct. Sexual identities are constructed simply by language. So politically, changing the use of language is central to transforming the gender order of society. Hence the importance today of forcing people to use the politically correct language and pronouns. This reordering of reality is again done in the name of liberation for all, because for the radical feminist, creational Christian norms are all about oppression. Essentially, for Butler and her numerous disciples today, there is no such thing as men and women, because over against the plain observable facts, the idea of biological sex is a fantasy. Gender is not related to biological sex, but is free-flowing and fluid. There is no such thing as normative sexual identity. Rather, your identity is centered in your orientation, which is said to be mutable and freely chosen, regardless of whether you are a man or woman. Christian sexual morality and family with its binary norm is for Butler and her followers the dictatorship of nature, which must be rebelled against and destroyed. All the sexual revolutionaries of the 20th and 21st century find the root of their revolutionary spirit in the self-creating illusions of Marxism, with its visceral hatred of both God and the family. As Marx himself once wrote, "The secret to the Holy Family is the earthly family. To make the former disappear, the latter must be destroyed in theory and in practice." And so the past 100 years or so have given us the interrelated evolutionary, existential, technological, revolutionary, psychological, feminist, and gender fluid views of the human person. The cultural implications are all around us. You can choose from any number of self-chosen identities on Facebook. As a result of the many decades of theoretical, social, and political assault on Christian sexual ethics, the norms which are part of any society's operating system are being radically altered. As this alteration occurs, new social and legal penalties are introduced to protect the new norms. For every society protects sexual norms with penalties. This radical sexual identity crisis afflicting our culture reflects the religious crisis of our time. People are in the grip of spiritual confusion. I already noted that we must be critically aware that lying behind all these ideas are religious presuppositions, very ancient in origin, which are now being dressed up in a new pseudo-scientific garb and applied socially in the most radical way. Ancient Greek mythology set male gods like Uranus and Zeus against female goddesses like Gaia and Hera. This suggested a struggle basic to sexual relations, as in feminism, that is foreign to the Christian view of the world. Then philosophically, the influential school of Plato taught a unisex or androgynous perspective on origins because the soul substance in philosophical thought was sexless. This is a religious denial of the binary, that is, of distinction of the male and female that the Bible says God made from the beginning of creation. The positing of original sexless origins and the primitive androgynous emergence of humankind, as well as a denial of the even more fundamental creator-creature distinction itself, is basic to pagan humanistic thought. And once the male-female distinction falls, other creational categories also become irrelevant. Ultimately, the philosopher Anthony Kenny has pointed to the culmination of the philosophical theology of the classical world in the Greek philosopher Plotinus and his abstract vision of the One, a divinity concept that claims all reality is one. That is, the universe is all there is and is divine. All their gods and goddesses are stationed inside the universe, where ultimate reality is a bare, blank unity. There is no creator-creature distinction in non-theistic worldviews. This philosophical idol of an original oneness, where one is all and all is an expression of the divine, creates a huge problem for knowledge of reality and things like human sexuality. The problem is, how can predication, differentiation, defining or describing anything be carried on meaningfully if everything is at bottom actually one, though manifest in a kind of temporary fluidity or flux? The answer is that, as the thinkers I mentioned earlier have argued, universal truth, objectivity, law, and creation order must be denied. Only an endless denial of creational distinctions in such a view leads to deeper understandings of reality. For these creational distinctions of true and false, male and female, are fictive. In short, true knowledge becomes impossible. Yet the fact is that our experience of the world reveals lawful orderliness to all things, including our sexuality. We are not the creators of our own reality, identity, or sexuality. We are creatures embedded in a given creation order with order diversity. The meaningful order diversity of creation, that is, the unity in diversity that we see, points beyond itself to a personal, purposeful, and relational unity in diversity required for meaning and true knowledge to find a starting point. Because the Apostle John tells us the Word was with God and was God, we see that the God of Scripture is not an ineffable blank unity identified with the universe who cannot create or reveal himself, but is distinct from his creation as the foundation and precondition of all intelligible experience. The triune God is the transcendent starting point for knowledge, law, and truth in any area of life or thought. In the Gospels, Jesus himself points to the original creation ordinances. Our first parents were created male and female in God's image. Thus, each was made for the other, with the specific purpose of joining together one man and one woman in the most intimate of relationships. There is an important sense in which our very bodies, in the mystery and intimacy of self-giving communion in marriage, tell us something about the relational nature of God. A man's body does not make sense alone, neither does the body of a woman. They were evidently made for each other. Jesus therefore reminds us that men and women were designed for one another creationally, and in marriage, in a unique and lasting bond. The scripture says, "A man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." Jesus clearly sees Genesis 1:27 and Genesis 2:24 as an original divine ordinance, not simply as a description of the typical way things happen to go on earth in the historical process. In other words, male and female and marriage are not socially constructed fictions. Jesus Christ also categorically asserts that such a divine norm must not be tampered with. It is God who makes the union possible, who issued the command to be fruitful, who said it was not good for man to be alone, and who brought Eve to Adam in marriage as father of the bride. Marriage is thus God's ordinance for human beings. As such, there is only one safe, lastingly satisfying context for sexual pleasure and intimacy in the Bible, and that is in the sacred, secure, covenantal union of the marriage relationship. As such, sexual immorality, be it fornication, adultery, homosexuality, incest, bestiality, or any other distortion of the marriage bond, are regarded as anti-normative and sinful in Scripture. This is not to spoil a person's fun, but to protect, preserve, bless, fulfill, and nurture the human community that is founded in the creational family structure. The desperate search for self-knowledge to discover our identity in our time is producing great pain and suffering in the area of sexuality. Our identity as human beings is not self-created, nor is it defined by what we do with our sexual organs. The I think, I feel, I believe are all functions of the human heart. We cannot reach the root of the nature of a human person by simple reflection on the relation of our sense of self to the body and sexual desires, nor by our relationship simply to other human beings who have the same problems and identity challenges we do. Our only help for human identity comes from our religious relation to our Creator, who made us in His image. It is from this relation to God that all other relations to our bodies, our activities, and to others receive their meaning, direction, and content. God has revealed us to ourselves as being created as His image bearers. We cannot live on the illusion that we are independent and self-sufficient like God Himself. We only truly live and discover who we are in terms of our relationship to God. We cannot reduce our identity to social or historical aspects or feeling aspects of life without losing the true knowledge of both God and ourselves. In the Christian gospel, it is in Jesus Christ alone, the Word made flesh, that we discover who we are and the meaningfulness of our life. Though we are fallen from God in our sexual sins, Christ has come to redeem the totality of our life, including the blessing of our sexuality, and restore it to God's creational purposes.